Okay everyone, so this is going to be a good time. Now we get to talk about the steps of photosynthesis, what we call the light-dependent reaction. As you could tell last video, my voice was a bit hoarse, so I've switched from water to my go-to Diet Pepsi. A bit too early for my second Red Bull of the day, so we're going with Diet Pepsi. Okay, so the light-dependent reaction of photosynthesis is actually the first step of photosynthesis. There's two parts to photosynthesis. The photo involves light. The synthesis is called the dark reaction, and that's actually not something that right now we're going to be going over. So we're only going to be going over what's called the light-dependent reaction. Now on the board you're going to see a couple things. The first thing you're going to see is, and this is the chloroplast. Actually, the outer two membranes of the chloroplast. So the chloroplast has not one phospholipid bilayer, it actually has two phospholipid bilayers, one on the outside and one on the inside. I drew the one on the outside bigger just because there's more things going on in there and we need more space. So let's kind of go over the things that I drew here. Now the first thing I drew is going to be what's called photosystem 2. Now what photosystem 2 is, it's a group of proteins that absorb light energy. So I'll do this in black. I'm going to put down light energy. Now this is done by a series of pigments, mainly chlorophyll, which not to draw too much in green, but I'm going to, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and draw it in blue. And chlorophyll's job is to absorb light from the outside environment. And it's really good at absorbing different wavelengths of light, which we'll talk about probably in another class. So what it does is going to absorb different wavelengths of light. So blue is the chlorophyll. It's going to absorb different wavelengths of light. And what it's going to do is it's going to use that light to do a couple of things. Now, moving on here, we have a enzyme called ATP synthase. Now, the job of ATP synthase is to convert ADP into ATP. So if I'm going to write over here, its job is to convert ADP, and it's going to take a phosphate, and it's going to create ATP. That's its job. But as we talked about a couple classes ago, it's not going to make much sense if we use ATP to make ATP. So we need a way to power this enzyme without ATP, and we'll talk about that in just a couple minutes. Now next we have photosystem 1. Photosystem 1's job is to reduce a very important coenzyme called NADP. What it's going to do is it's going to convert this very potent coenzyme, NADP+, and it's going to reduce it to NADPH. And photosystem 1 is very similar. It's going to take chlorophyll, it's going to absorb light, it's going to use that light in order to excite electrons in order to load on to NADP+ to reduce it. So once again, chlorophyll. Alright, so I'm going to try and simplify this as much as possible just because this is not a biochemistry class, this is not a university level biology class for biochemists or whatever. This is high school AP biology, so I'm going to do my best to make this in as decently understandable ways as possible. So let's start at the beginning. We know that the main ingredients for photosynthesis, at least in the light-dependent reaction, is going to be water and light. Those are the two most important things. So what's going to happen is we have this molecule of water. We actually need two of them at once, and I'll explain why in a moment. What's going to happen is that this light energy is going to be so powerful that it's basically going to cause water to fall apart. So if you have two molecules of water, what's going to happen is this. The water molecule is going to fall apart. We know that each water here has one oxygen. It's going to combine to form oxygen. So one of the products is going to be oxygen, and really the plant has no use for oxygen at this time. So it's actually going to release it into the atmosphere as waste. Of course, not so much waste for us because we actually really need this oxygen in order to, well, live. But the real value for the plant is these atoms called hydrogens. I'm going to draw here, also known as protons. Now, basically, what we want to do is we want to force these hydrogens through ATP synthase so we can power the enzyme and make ATP. The problem is, and this is a big problem with concentration gradients, is there's actually much more hydrogen inside the lumen of the chloroplast than outside. So I'm just going to draw here super high concentration of hydrogens. Now, anytime we want to move anything against this concentration gradient, we're actually going to need to use energy. Once again, that's not going to help us in this case because we'll be using too much energy to make energy. Like spending $1.25 for $1. Not going to make too much sense long term. Sorry, just wanted to make sure that it was recording. Now what's going to happen is that when photosystem 2, when the chlorophyll inside photosystem 2 absorbs the light, it's going to use that light energy to basically cause water to fall apart. The oxygens are going to combine and leave through waste, and the hydrogens from water are going to be used to become free. Now something else the water has is going to be molecules, not molecules, subatomic particles, which I'll draw here in black, why not, called electrons. Now, I don't pretend to know too much about chemistry, but what's going to happen is that these electrons are going to be very excited because they've just been infused with a bunch of electricity. So they're going to be in a very high energy state. Because of that, they're actually going to move down their own concentration gradient. They're going to move down a series of proteins, and we call this the electron transport chain. It's actually going to move from photosystem 2 to photosystem 1. And basically, they just keep on moving, keep on moving, keep on moving, until they get to photosystem 1. So this here in black is called the ETC, or the electron transport chain. Now, why is that significant? Well, one, when these electrons move from one side of the membrane to the other, it doesn't take energy. They're already energized through light. Now, what we also know is that there's a term called electronegativity. And in this case, in electronegative gradient. Now we do know that opposites attract. So what's going to happen, and this is really nice, what's going to happen is the power from the electron movement is going to move the hydrogens from one side of the membrane to the other, like so. Now, this energy from the electron movement is actually going to cause hydrogens to move down through ATP synthase and into the lumen of the chloroplast. So if we're going to draw what's going on here, oh, hold on, somebody's trying to get in. Hey. I'm recording a video, so don't mind me talking. A student just walked in. She wants to learn about photosynthesis. Hello, Alyssa. I like the hat. Okay, so what's going to happen here is we're going to have hydrogen movement through the inner membrane, and what that's going to do is it's going to power ATP. So we've solved a couple of problems here. One is we solved the problem of how hydrogens are going to move from a low concentration to a higher concentration, and we solved the problem of how we're going to make ATP without using ATP. And of course, that's done through the movement of hydrogens, thanks to the movement of electrons. Okay, so now that we've done that, we have another problem. We need to get electrons onto this coenzyme called NADP+. The reason for that is we need actually building blocks in order to create the sugars that's going to happen in the next step of photosynthesis. So we need to add two things onto this. We need to add electrons and hydrogens. What's going to happen here is that photosystem 1 is actually going to help transfer the electrons from the sunlight, because it also absorbs sunlight, and it's going to put it onto NADP+, which is going to reduce it. To reduce means to make more negative. And what's going to happen also is some of the electrons from the concentration gradient, they're also going to be loaded on to NADP+, to become NADPH. Now what this is going to do is now we have hydrogens and we have electrons to make what's eventually going to become glucose. Because as we know, the chemical formula for glucose, C6H12O6, and that's mainly going to be from three things: hydrogens, electrons, and carbon dioxide. All right, so let's recap this once more. We have over here two photosystems that contain a pigment called chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is going to absorb certain wavelengths of light, and when it does that, it's going to excite electrons. As we know, excited things tend to move in higher energy states, meaning that they have higher energy. Oh, 1 second. Hello, Jen.
Hey, sorry to interrupt. Did you get someone to sub for you for the class that you listed on the
Yeah,
you sent
yeah.
out? Okay, just
Yeah,
want to make sure.
today it's going to be a D, and it's going to be Dana.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, sorry about homeroom because I
That's okay.
got one.
It
as
turns
well.
out I got my dates mixed up. I don't need homeroom until yeah, I'll be fine for
Okay.
that. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm just
I just wanted to make sure.
scattered in general.
Oh, I'm feeling it.
Yeah. Okay, so let's recap this once more. Photosystem 1 is going to do the same thing, absorb light. So what's going to happen is that plants have plenty of water. The light from photosystem 2 is going to be absorbed, and it's going to be used to more or less cause water to break apart. Oxygen from water is a waste product, it's going to leave. The hydrogens, though, are going to collect in the space between the two membranes, and the electrons, also from the water, are going to move down the chain from photosystem 2 to photosystem 1. As that happens, the hydrogens released from water are going to move along with it, and it's going to be used to power ATP synthase, which is going to make ATP. Now, the electrons are going to continue moving to photosystem 1, and they're going to be used to reduce NADP plus to NADPH, because we're going to have electrons added here and hydrogens to make NADPH. What are these used for? The ATP is going to be used for the energy to make the glucose in the next reaction, And the hydrogens and the electrons are going to be used to also build the molecule. In case you're curious what NADP plus is, it is a carrier. So it carries electrons and hydrogens. All right, so that's basically the steps of the light-dependent reaction. If you go to the PowerPoint, I have some fun questions for you, and they also have this recapped through images.